Hello, puppies and kittens. At the risk of being accused of, or to avoid the risk of being accused of being an echo chamber, my preference is to talk to people who have a different set of, well, let's say, understandings. I don't like to say that I believe anything because I don't think that's appropriate. But in this case, we have somebody who emailed me to say that I think he said he was a Christian, but he's a student of the philosophy of religion and a believer in God. That much, at least, we know. So, Matthew, hello.
Hello. Yeah, so just to clarify, I'm not a Christian. I'm a theist, but I'm not a Christian. So yeah,
Off start. What would your branch be then?
I'm not religious, so I believe that I was convinced by various philosophical arguments for the existence of God, but I don't think that the God the God that exists is the one described by any of the major religions. So I don't think, for instance, that God gave out the Quran to Muhammad, nor do I think that he is a triunity who became incarnate as a Jew in first century Roman Palestine, nor do I think that he provided revelation to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. I just think that they're sort of a generic God who created the world. Yeah, my name is Matthew. I'm a student of philosophy at the University of Michigan. Okay. I have a blog called Bentham's Bulldog. And yeah, so that's basically who I am. And yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, I got a number of questions because, one, I try not to assume too much, but clearly when I made the thumbnail of this or the title of this, I was assuming that this is going to be yet another Christian, because here in the U.S., if you speak English, you're a Christian. I mean, that's basically how, and most of the time, if you don't speak English, you're still a Christian. It's just what we end up with on this continent. So I'm pleasantly surprised that you are not. That was not expected. I'm still curious, though, as to what your position is.
So my position is that God exists. I think that there is a conscious agent that created the universe, limitless in power, knowledge, and goodness.
Okay. And what gave you the impression that that was even possible?
So I think that if you look at the facts about the world, there are many facts about the world that I think are nicely explained by the supposition that a God exists. And just as, for example, with the scientific theory, we'll assume that a scientific theory is correct if it has sufficient explanatory power. One of the reasons why, for instance, we believe in evolution is because it so nicely explains so many things about biology that would otherwise be deeply puzzling. In similar fashion, I think that a God explains lots about the world. For instance, the fine-tuning of the constants.
I don't see any indication that a God is even possible, much less involved. Much less, we don't even know what a God is. Well, we do know this. I mean, every deity, because deity means God, every deity that was worshipped by anybody was a magical anthropomorphic immortal. So that's what a God is. I don't know another way to define that. We're going to come up with a new entity and come up with a new definition, in which case we need that definition. Why would we be calling it a God then if it's not?
So I think that what theists typically in the modern era mean by God is that there's an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being who created the universe, which is what my view is. Now, in terms of the point about what reasons to believe that the thing is possible, I don't think that this is actually the methodology that's employed in the sciences or in other serious fields. So take dark matter as an example.
What? You don't think that figuring out the mechanisms by which things function is applicable to science?
Well, so what I was saying was that I don't think that you start by proving that the thing is possible. I don't know what it means to prove that a thing is possible. And I don't think
if we were arguing evolution, for example, I would have to show you that the demonstration that evolution is confirmed to some degree, that we can show the possibility in whatever population, we demonstrate that, right? So we have a mechanism and we can show that this is an actual potentiality. There's a possibility here. Let's explore it further. Why are we arguing something that's not even possible?
So, well, I think it is possible, but I think that you don't start by proving that the thing is possible. You instead consider the evidence for it. So take dark matter, for instance.
Well, let's consider whichever way you want to go. Show me that it's possible, because we're going to need that. You're not going to be able to avoid it. And then two, we do need the evidence. And that evidence is going to have to include that it's possible.
Okay, so consider dark matter, for instance. How do you think scientists went about showing that dark matter was possible? Because my sense is that they didn't. What they did was they looked at a variety of findings in astronomy, and they noted that all of those findings would be very well explained on the supposition that there is a kind of invisible matter. So they concluded that that thing existed, and then from that they infer that it's possible. I'd be curious to know what kind of possibility you're talking about. So there are different kinds of possibility. There's logical possibility, there's metaphysical possibility, and there's physical possibility. So which of the kinds?
The way I term it is that in order to declare whether something is possible, there has to be a precedent or a parallel or a verified indication or a verified phenomenon indicating that that is a possibility.
So what about? So can you explain how you think that worked with dark matter, for instance?
I don't do cosmogony or cosmology. I have no idea. I don't even study dark matter. I don't even know if it's a thing.
Okay, so take an example in history. Take the example of of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants.
Okay.
So I think we have very good evidence that that happened from the historical record. It wasn't first demonstrated that that was possible. In fact, before we discovered that it was real, it was thought that you couldn't cross the Alps.
So we have a verified phenomenon.
Right. Okay. Right. So I agree that you'll need evidence that verifies it. Now we can talk about the right conception of evidence. I think evidence is simply a fact that makes a hypothesis more likely. So,
okay, well then let's define our terms, because when we talk about evolution again, if you've ever talked to a creationist, you know that they will tell you that it is one thing giving birth to or changing into another fundamentally different thing, which is a complete distortion. So we have to know what we're talking about so that we don't talk past each other. The fuck is a god?
So a god, as I was describing earlier, is an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being who created the universe.
Listing a bunch of contradictions is not going to help your case.
But you were asking me what it was, and so I was giving you the definition.
So we should get
the definition is that it has the omni properties.
Also contradict each other.
Which omni properties do you think contradict each other?
But we have a universe that is fine-tuned for life, even though we will die everywhere.
Right. So when we say that the constants are finely tuned, what we mean is simply that out of all the configurations that the constants could have taken on, virtually none of them would have given rise to any possibility of any life. Okay. And so the fact that we have constants fall in an infinitesimally narrow range, that's the only one that could give rise to complex structure.
If they were outside the extremely narrow range that you're talking about, then we would still have life. It'd just be different. We would still have functionality. It would just be different. So, and I don't mean widely outside that range. I mean just slightly outside of the narrow range that people, when they talk about fine tuning, that they usually bring up. Because fine tuning, especially if we're talking about an intelligent designer, you look at this universe. Clearly, this universe was not created for us. We're definitely not a priority on which everything was built.
Okay, so
God can create things any way he wants, and he would be able to create things in such a way that we could exist everywhere, not just here.
Okay, so let me first address the point about how if the constants weren't finely tuned, then life would have arisen under different conditions. I think that is clearly wrong. Take, for instance, the cosmological constant.
I said that the range that you're talking about, the fine-tuning argument, typically puts things into such a small range as to be absurd. You can go outside of that range. Just like the argument that people say that if we were 100 miles, if the Earth was 100 miles closer to or further from the sun, then we would burn up or we would freeze. And we know that the ellipse of the orbit is well beyond that. So they put on these constraints that they think that they think that we're narrowed to, but we're not really. You can go outside of that bound.
I'll agree with you that there are ways that people present the fine-tuning argument where they'll give examples of parameters that are not actually finely tuned parameters. So I agree that many of the things that people point to when they're arguing that the Earth is uniquely situated to give rise to life, many of those things are wrong. I don't think that there's a good fine-tuning argument from the unique situation of Earth. And they
I will agree that I don't think there's a good fine-tuning argument.
Well, you should have heard the end of the sentence. But I was just saying from where Earth is situated. But what I think there is a good fine-tuning argument.
Let's ignore the Earth for a moment.
Yeah,
what I think cosmos, right? So if you compare the rest of the cosmos to the Earth, now let's think about that God again. How was the universe fine-tuned? What was the purpose of creation? And what was the necessity of a God?
Sorry, so you're making quite a few different points. I want to first address the point about
Okay.
whether or not you could have gotten life under different conditions. So take the most profound. So take the most profound instance of fine-tuning, which is of the cosmological constant. Of the values that the cosmological constant could have taken on, consistent with the standard model, only about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120th of the values that it could have taken on would have given rise to anything of complexity. If it were weaker than falling in that range, the universe would have collapsed in on itself far less than 1 millisecond after the Big Bang. If it were stronger, every particle would have flown apart and there would have been no stable complexity. No particles would have interacted. So my question for you is, if every particle flew apart, or if the universe collapsed less than 1 millisecond after the Big Bang, do you think that that would be a condition under which life could arise?
There are so many different ways to approach this that I've heard other people. As I said, I don't study cosmogony or cosmology, and I don't really care, because it doesn't matter, whether the universe had a beginning or not. It doesn't change anything from my perspective. But one of the arguments that I've heard is, one, it could be that this is the only way that a universe could be. Two, there might be millions of universes, and they can all have different parameters, but we, of course, are aware of this one because we're here and we're talking. And the phenomenal waste of the universe as an expanse insists that it cannot have been created for life. Certainly not with us in mind.
I'm happy to talk about any of those points, but I think it's important to stay one point at a time so that we can get to the bottom of it. So earlier you were suggesting that life could have arisen under different conditions, and I gave my response. Right, and I gave my response to that, which is that of the values that the cosmological constant could take on, only about 1 part in 10 to the 120th of them would result in the universe not immediately collapsing in on itself and not immediately flying apart.
I've read that was not an accurate argument. It's not one I'm familiar with, so it's not one I'm going to make. But I've read where physicists argue that that's not true. I will let them argue that point. As I said, I don't know it intimately myself. But even if we were to assume that's true, and I don't think it is, we would still get into the expansive waste of this universe and the impossibility of anybody conjuring it.
Right. Okay. So we can talk about the point about waste. So I don't. And sorry, is there background noise on my end?
A little bit. I'm not worried about it.
Sorry. Okay. So regarding the point about waste, so what we need to look at is the relative probabilities. Assuming the probabilities are vanishingly low on atheism, even if it's not guaranteed, even if the
probabilities have to do with atheism.
So when I mean by atheism is the supposition that there are no gods, and so if there is,
what about what atheism really is?
So I disagree with you about what the standard definition of atheism is, but fine.
You're welcome to be wrong.
I use the term.
I have a wrong opinion. You don't have to agree with me, but I can prove my point.
Sorry, when I say under atheism,
lack of belief or the absence of belief is a non-belief in the existence.
Yeah. So I don't think that's the right definition of atheism, but I don't think that's the most
definition ever given for atheism ending in an M is the same one still from the 1700s to today. Is the same definition that atheist organizations still use and still identify by. It comes down simply to this. Does the subject have a belief in God? If the answer is yes, then they are a theist. If the answer is no, they are atheist.
So I don't think this is the right definition. I don't think, for example, that
you may not think so, but that is correct. And
I don't think this is the most productive thing to haggle over. So maybe I'm using the definition.
When you're talking to an atheist, somebody who can prove that atheism is just a lack of belief, then you should probably take the stance that atheism is a lack of belief and not tell me that I believe things I don't.
Well, I wasn't saying about what you believe. Just when I use the term, and if this is going to cause
incorrectly, when you use the term incorrectly, okay, gotcha.
Okay, for the rest of the conversation, I will use the term stipulatively to mean the worldview that there's no God, just because that's how I'm used to talking. That's how I talked when I was an atheist.
You're not going to correct it. Got it.
If this is going to cause friction, I would be happy to try to talk about rather than use the word atheist to say if there is no God. Okay, fine. So
what non-belief? Non-theism.
So if there
rather use non-theism, does that make more sense to you?
I'll just say if there is no God. Okay, if there is no God, then it seems very unlikely that you would get to the finely tuned constants. Well, if there is a God,
But
even if
there's
you think
no
that,
possibility for a God, A, to exist, 2, to do anything, and
why do you
3,
think it's
to
impossible
create
for
these
God to exist?
constants.
Sorry, why do you think it's impossible that God exists?
Where is there a possibility? You're proposing something that is essentially magic, that lives outside the universe, which also doesn't make any sense, that can, I guess, I don't know, chant magic words or make wishes, and the wishes come true because he says so. All of this is nonsense. None of it is supported. You have to be able to show that some of this is at least possible before we can begin.
Right. So what? Let's go back to the example with
Okay.
with
Would you accept
Hannibal.
that it's possible that a universe can exist as this universe exists?
Yes.
Okay, even if there's no God.
Yes. I just
Okay.
think that it's less likely. Just as, for instance, I think
Okay.
it's possible that we'd have all the writings about Hannibal crossing the Alps, even if Hannibal didn't really cross the Alps. It's possible that there's been some vast conspiracy to fabricate it, but it's just very unlikely, and so it's not worth believing. We should follow the evidence, not look merely at what's possible.
Okay, so we have, what do you prefer, Occam's razor or Hitchens' razor?
I don't know about Hitchens' razor.
Positive claims require positive evidence. You're asserting that there's a God. So we need to have positive evidence of that. And what is asserted without evidence? This is Hitchens' razor. What is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence.
Right. So I think there are lots of lines of evidence for the existence of God. One of them that I was bringing up was the fine tuning of the constants, in particular
Which
the cosmological.
we already agree the universe can exist as it is with the constants that it has without a God. So now you want to take what is and add to it a still undefined, still impossible.
It's not undefined. I defined it earlier.
Being.
So, well, regarding all this talk about it being magic, so I don't actually think that the right way to proceed when evaluating between different hypotheses is to basically
we're still asking for a definition, aren't we?
Is to sort of give them like silly names, right? So, for example, I think when creationists are talking with people who believe in evolution, to be clear, I think evolution is true. You know, I'm very much, you know, I think evolution certainly happened, and I find it ridiculous that people deny it. But you know, one tactic that they'll often use is they'll say, "Oh, you believe that your great grand, you know, many more greats, grandfather was a single-celled organism. Ah, that's so ridiculous. That's magical and fantastical. That's not actually a productive way to proceed."
But what if we're using the accurate definition of magic as it actually is applied? If we go through a collection of dictionaries just to make sure that we get all of them agree to some degree as to what magic is, and that actually does literally apply to what you're talking about. And then magic becomes a fully appropriate and applicable term.
Well,
so
I think
the evocation of the supernatural to control or forecast natural events in ways that are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics, right? That's magic, that's miracle, that's the same definition. So when you're talking about the supernatural, you're talking about the magical. Miracle, miraculous magic, magical miracle, same thing.
So I don't know what the right definition of magic is. A while ago I was reading an article
the one I just gave you.
And it concludes. Sorry, you did cut out slightly, so I didn't hear the definition that you gave.
It's the evocation of supernatural forces to control or forecast natural events.
And what does supernatural mean?
Exactly. That means that outside of the laws of physics, meaning that it is literally physically impossible.
Okay, so suppose that someone, for instance,
or requires new physics.
Okay, so suppose that, for instance, someone is a Cartesian dualist, where they think that minds are non-physical entities and they exert physical effects. Would you say a Cartesian dualist believes in magic?
I don't have a lot of respect for Descartes, I would have to say.
But would you say that Cartesian dualists, who make up a sizable portion of modern philosophers, believe in magic?
There's no support for dualism at all.
And, well, I disagree with that too. But
okay,
but regardless of whether you think dualism is true, would you say that believers in dualism believe in magic?
Yes, and I
Okay.
got this from both neuroscientists Patricia Churchland and also Daniel Dennett while he was still alive. Both
I
of
mean, I
them,
think those. I don't think very highly of either of those of their views
I
on
think very
philosophy of mind.
highly, especially of Dennett, having met him, and he was a wonderful guy.
Yeah.
Of the
To be
four
clear,
horsemen, he was the one that I resonated with absolutely the most. Genuine sweetheart. 6'3" and still wanted to give me the front seat in the car to the airport. That was just no. You're
to be
not.
clear, I wasn't making like a personal attack on Dennett. I think he seemed like quite a genial fellow. I was merely saying that I don't think very highly of his views on philosophy of mind. But that would take us somewhat far
I've
afield.
also interviewed a host of neuroscientists, not all of whom I can name because of the kind of email contacts that we were having, but all of them, and I think there were at least 5. All of them agreed that not only is there no evidence of a soul, right where it would be if the soul was real, but there's substantial evidence against it. And that negates at least the Christian version of God. Now, if you've got a deistic concept, then we can ignore all that because we don't need a soul for that.
So I mean, most dualists don't think there are souls. Now I do, but sorry, I feel like this would take us
If you think
somewhat
that the
far
mind is
afield
independent of the
of the
physical
existence
body,
of God.
then yeah, that's what that is.
So what most dualists are what's known as property dualists, where they think that
When you say
there's
most,
there-
that's implying a majority. And you and I both know that the majority of people believe they have a soul, and the majority of those people believe they have a soul because they believe they're going to go to heaven or hell. Whether they're Christian or Muslim, that is the majority.
yeah, sorry, let me be more precise. What I meant to say was among philosophers, what the majority of dualists believe. Yeah, and yes, I certainly should have been more precise about that, right? Because most people do not have the same views as most philosophers. But most philosophers are what are known, at least of the dualists, are what are known as property dualists, where they think that there's physical stuff that has non-physical properties, not that there's some sort of distinct non-physical substance.
And what is non-physical properties or non-physical substance? Because isn't that just isn't that a contradiction in itself?
No, I don't see why it's a contradiction.
Non-physical properties?
Sorry, I think my internet's not very good, so I missed your most recent question.
I don't understand what non-physical properties are.
It means that their properties, they're things about the way, there are ways that things are, but they're not physical. So they don't, for instance, have a spatiotemporal location. Now, I can give you some of the arguments for dualism. So one of the arguments that moves me a lot is the Mary's room argument. So the idea of the Mary's room argument is, you imagine the world's best neuroscientist. She's in a black and white room, and she is informed of all of the relevant facts about neuroscience. That is to say, she's informed, she reads all the textbooks. She reads just everything that could be read about neuroscience. Okay. But she's in a black and white room, so she's never seen anything read. Okay, so now suppose that Mary exits the black and white room and sees a red apple. It seems like Mary has learned something new. That is to say, Mary now knows what it's like to see red when she didn't know that before. And so from this, we can construct an argument for non-physicalism about the mind, which is premise 1, when Mary was in the room, Mary...
No.
Sorry, let me just finish laying out the argument briefly, and then you can put it. So the argument would be,
when Mary was in... so many times before, and I'm sure people in the audience have heard this also so many times before, and it's not the argument you think it is. But finish it.
Okay, right. So the first premise is, when Mary's in the room, she knows all the physical facts about what goes on when a person sees red. And then the second premise would be, but when Mary leaves the room, she learns something new. She learns a new fact. And so therefore, there are non-physical facts about what it's like to see red. Okay, go ahead. What's wrong with the argument?
All of that is still physical. The way that we see is physical. The way that we interpret in our minds is physical. Connecting neurons, synapses, these are all physical. The type of the way that photons reflect off of our retina, all of it physical. Now, I often argue because I argue with every form of idiot, and some of them like to pretend that the universe is a simulation, not of something that's real, that's being simulated. No, it's just like it's like the simulation is the only thing that's real. And the people who make this argument don't seem to understand. They're making this argument for God, but they don't understand what a liar that makes God out to be, because we understand that the way that our eyes work, the way that we see, changing energy states in atoms that create these photons that then reflect off of different things. That the way that we see it reflected off our retina to be every color, but that whatever. The way that we have our olfactory senses explained, the way that our hearing is explained, the way that our sight is explained, all of this would imply that if this is a simulation in which there is no actual atom and thus no photons, then God has created this elaborate illusion just to deliberately fool us. And this is my problem with that argument. So that this is the only way I can go with what I'm hearing you say right now.
Okay, well, so figuring out whether dualism is right is somewhat orthogonal to figuring out whether God exists. That said, I didn't find your response persuasive because your response did not involve rejecting either premise of the argument. It involved merely repeating your position, which is that it's physical. Now, what dualists think is that while the brain is a physical organ, the brain gives rise to a non-physical consciousness. And the reason to think that is precisely the argument I gave, none of the premises of which you rejected.
I didn't object to all of them. What did I miss?
Sorry. So, okay, well, let's go through the premises one by one. So when Mary exits the room, do you think that Mary learns something new after seeing a red apple?
Of course, having nothing to do with your conclusion, yes.
Okay, and so then second, do you agree that when Mary was in the room,
the problem
she was
with
aware?
Theistic arguments is the premises, all of them are usually flawed, and the conclusion is a non sequitur. And in your case, the conclusion is a non sequitur. And this is
okay.
All theistic arguments. I've never seen one that was correct. Every one of them suffers this failure. And this is what
so I obviously disagree with you about the failure of theistic arguments, but right now we're not talking about a theistic argument, we're talking about an argument for dualism.
There were only black or white things, or whether for whatever conditions you can only see black and white. Then she steps out of the room. She's no longer under the influence of the filters in that room or whatever, or the restrictions that are put in that room. And now she sees red. And you said non sequitur, thus evidence of non-physical. No. Being outside of a black and white room where everything is black and white, or whether it is filtered to be black and white, and now you're able to see color again, just still physical. So you don't get a non sequitur conclusion.
So sorry. So this is a common misunderstanding of the Mary's room argument. The argument is not about whether Mary would have a new experience. The argument is about whether Mary would learn something new. So everyone agrees that Mary would have a new experience. But the question is whether. But wait. The question is whether Mary would.
We both accept Mary would learn something new. No indication whatsoever of anything supernatural or non-physical or dualist.
So the reason why it's an indication of something non-physical is that when Mary was in the room, she was able to learn all of the physical facts. And so then if she learns something new when exiting the room, then what she learns must be a non-physical fact. If she learns something new, it's not a physical fact, it's a non-physical fact.
Learn that she has color sensors in her eyes.
But Mary already knew she had color sensors in her eyes. She knew all the physical facts. From reading textbooks,
all the physical facts, she already knew how to see a red apple before she left. Or she knew that it would be capable once she leaves that room. Because that's
yes, Mary already knew that she would be capable of seeing a red apple. What she didn't know was what a red apple looked like.
Okay. So she learns then what a red apple looks like because of fully physical explanations. Thus, no indication of either dualism or the supernatural or anything non-physical.
Okay, so you agree Mary learned something new. Do you agree that when Mary was in the room, she knew all of the physical facts about?
So you said she knew all of them, but then you started putting restrictions as soon as she comes out of the room. So there are physical facts she could not have known when she came out.
Well, sorry. So your position would be Mary, when she was in the room, she did not know every physical fact.
Well, that's what you're saying. Your conclusion.
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, but it's not what you think you're saying. But that's what it's implying. So the fact that she learns a new thing, non sequitur, this is where the record scratches. You're too young to understand what that means. But this is where we jump to the non sequitur conclusion, where evidence of the supernatural. No, it's not.
The conclusion is that there are non-physical facts about consciousness. It's not that there's a
What's a
supernatural realm.
non-physical fact about consciousness?
So it's a fact about consciousness that's not merely about the behavior of atoms. So there's a commonly held view is that the experience of red, for instance, experiences are not the sorts of things that are made of atoms.
So you don't think that experiences, which are stored in the brain, which are created by neuronal connections, and they're chemical, they're electrochemical, and neuroscientists insist, all of them universally by consensus, this is entirely physical. But you're going against all neuroscientists, including the two neural philosophers that I mentioned before, because you don't like them for whatever reason. But they're world-renowned experts, and you're better than them because you disagree for a reason that you can't justify.
So I disagree that it's for a reason I can't justify. I disagree that this is the universal consensus among neuroscientists. There are lots of dualist neuroscientists. In fact,
I can't ask one neuroscientist because you could always find one of somebody, but I bet you can't find four. Not in the whole world could you find four that can, and you certainly can't find anybody that can show. You can't find one who can show evidence of the supernatural that you're talking about, because all you'd need, is one.
So I don't know very many neuroscientists off the top of my head, but my view, I'm fairly sure that among neuroscientists,
clearly not many neuroscientists.
I've spoken to some neuroscientists, but among neuroscientists, dualism is a minority view, but it's not an extreme minority view. Now, interestingly, the philosophers who you named, Dennett and Churchland, they're what are known as type A physicalists. So they don't even think Mary learns anything new when she leaves the room, which I find to be a very absurd position.
No, I would have to agree that she learns something new. We'll take, for example, that she's never seen red, so she can read all about red, but until she's experienced red, then that she has learned something new. Even if she knows all the details about it, she's seen it for herself, she's learned something new without the slightest indication at all of either dualism or the supernatural or whatever non-physical properties are.
Right.
And I don't think we're how long into this are we? 36 minutes. We're still waiting for the beginning of the argument to show whether a God is possible, much less reasons why anybody should believe that he ever actually did anything.
So we have gotten down a digression, though I think that is somewhat that's somewhat because you started talking about dualism. When I wasn't the one who brought it up.
You brought it up.
To be a dualist.
You brought it up.
I don't think so. I don't. But anyways,
I don't care about this because I'm not a big fan of philosophy. Only because I argue against creationists. I always only ever see philosophy misused, and so that's
well. See, if you argue against creationists, you will see lots of philosophy being misused. Sorry.
But when I argue against theism, I've never seen a good argument. Ever. The reason
I think you and I
atheist, when I used to believe in God myself, the issue was that I couldn't find any truth to it. There's a lot of things I would like to believe, and you don't have to prove that it's false. It's when I realized that there wasn't enough good, reliable reasons to justify believing it in the first place, I've already stopped believing it, even if it hasn't been proven false. Now you're going to come along and say that we have a universe that could just as easily exist as it is without a God.
But I think you're misunderstanding. I think you're misunderstanding.
And the last 40 minutes, we've been talking about other shit, not whatever convinced you that there was a God.
Oh, well, there were lots of things that convinced me that there was a God. One of the big ones was fine-tuning, which we've been talking about.
We've already explained.
No,
we can have a universe that is exactly as it is without a God. So let's mark that one off. Let's just get your eraser and take that one off your list. Fine-tuning argument does not work. Let's go for.
So I disagree with that, right? So, but that's not how evidence works. So the fact that you can have A given B and have A given not B
Yeah.
does not mean that A is not
But
evidence
the way
for B.
evidence works is you have a body of facts that are positively indicative of and or exclusively concordant with one available conclusion over any other. You don't have a fact that is positively indicative of a God and exclusively concordant with that conclusion. The fine-tuning argument does not work. We have to remove that from your list of evidence. So reject that. Let's go to the next best thing you've got.
Well, sorry, I think we should keep talking about fine-tuning. Right. So I agree that evidence, if some evidence is indicative of a hypothesis, even if then it's evidence for that hypothesis. And my claim is that fine-tuning is indicative of the existence of God, even if it's possible that you would get fine-tuning by chance. Just as suppose we're playing poker and I get 10 royal flushes in a row, and you accuse me of cheating, and I say, look, is my getting 10 royal flushes, is that possible if I'm not cheating? Of course it's possible. It's just sufficiently unlikely that you should think I'm cheating. In similar fashion, even though it's possible that you would get a finely tuned universe, even if there's no God, it's still evidence for the existence of God.
We're still not getting to where you show that there's any indication, no indication of God, no indication that a God is possible. Then the next step to get to where it's probable, and then
Okay, so
where
let me. I think I've given my answer before to your complaint that I haven't yet demonstrated that it's possible. So my response to that is
audience, we have a chat room. Please put in tags. Peter, check. Let me know what the poll turns out to be. Has he demonstrated that a God is possible?
So the way you get evidence that a thing is possible is often that you get evidence that it happened. Just as with, for example, with Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the way that we got, it wasn't that we first had evidence that it was possible that he crossed the Rubicon and then later discovered that he actually did it. It's that we got evidence that he did it, and so from that we inferred that crossing the Rubicon was the sort of thing that a person like Caesar could have done.
You have to have a precedent.
In similar fashion, we have evidence from fine-tuning that there's a God, and then from this we infer that God is possible.
How do we infer that God is possible?
Well, you get evidence. If you get evidence that a thing exists, then from this you can infer that a thing exists. Possible.
Okay, what thing exactly?
God.
You get evidence that a thing exists, that God exists, and then you can just okay. Since there is absolutely no actual factual evidence of God, nor logically valid arguments for it either, where do we start there?
So I disagree with you about that, and I was giving one of the arguments.
But you've disagreed about a couple of things you were wrong about. Where is the evidence for God?
Right. So one of the lines of evidence for God, the one that I've been discussing primarily so far, is fine-tuning.
Which we've already established doesn't work, and I don't need to go over it again. If the universe already,
I don't think we've established that.
If the universe that already exists can exist without a God, then how does that imply a God? It doesn't.
Aaron, do you remember what my reply to that was?
Yes.
What was my reply to
that? Quick interruption, Aaron. Quick interruption. The majority says no argument for the possibility of a God. We had, out of all the people who replied, I think 2 who said yes, but
out of 2. I mean, how many people we got watching right now? Check. I don't have the stream up. Well, I apologize.
300.
Oh, that's a much smaller turnout than I was expecting for this. Oh well.
I mean,
out of 300, we get 2 that agree with you.
But I somehow don't think that, like, your audience is a perfectly impartial adjudicator, as presumably your audience is disproportionately likely to agree with you.
You know how we can say that they are impartial? Because they started out believing that they were a God. Most of them.
I started out believing that there was not a God. I used to be an atheist, a few years ago.
Why would you believe that there is not a God?
Well, I thought that
belief. Do you know what a belief is?
A belief is the thing you think is true.
No, a belief, according to believers, is a thing you make believe, whether it's true or not.
No, I don't think that's what belief is.
Oh, that's
like if I say I believe.
identifies as a believer, they're going to believe what they want to believe, and they will even admit to you that they're going to keep believing it even if they know it's false.
So if I say, for example, I believe John will be here by noon, what I don't mean is I pretend that John will be here by noon. What I instead mean is I think it's the case
that John will be here, because imagination can become reality if you just believe hard enough, like the evangelicals do. Yeah, it's pretend. They don't use the word pretend. It's pretend.
Okay, so fine. If I would be happy to use a different word from believe, though I think you're using the word believe in a very non-standard way.
I'm using the word believe in a way that's consistent with the believers that I argue with every day, which is why I don't use belief. I no longer use, because the word used to mean to me whatever I think is most likely true or closest to the truth, but that I can't prove it because I don't actually know it, because I can't show it. But believers have a completely different stack. Believers assert knowledge of what is mere speculation.
But I think when believers say I believe in God, what they mean is I think it's the case that there is a God, just like what you mean when you say I believe that John will be here.
I used to think that too until I started arguing with them every day for decades. Most of them mean they're going to make themselves believe, because they've told me this in literal words. They are going to continue to believe even if they know that it's not true. Like that one pastor who said that if somewhere in the Bible it said that 2 + 2 = 5, I wouldn't question it. I wouldn't question what I read out of the Bible. I would believe it and try to understand it. And as William Jennings Bryan said, if the Bible said that Jonah swallowed the whale, I would believe it. So this is all about making yourself believe the most impossible things possible. Not possible, the most impossible things you can think of, and believing it anyway. That a man can walk on water, for example. You can say abracadabra and poof every species out of nothing.
Right. So I would grant lots of people who believe in God also have lots of totally unreasonable epistemological standards where they would continue to believe even without evidence. But that doesn't tell us about
that it's possible to believe in God for a rational reason.
Okay, well, let's get back to talking about fine-tuning then.
You're going to bring up fine-tuning again, you're going to fail. Because we've already established multiple times now, if we can already have a universe that is as it is for a number of different possible explanations that don't involve a God, there's several different explanations for why we have this universe that doesn't have a God, then the fine-tuning argument doesn't work. It's incredibly wasteful that it would cause that God could have made a universe in which we could just live infinitely in infinite directions in any number of diversity. But no, we have where we only survive temporarily on a fraction of the skin of this one tiny mote of dust. And we're so impossibly far away from anything else, of instant death in every direction for hundreds of thousands of miles or millions of miles, then obviously the universe was not created for life. There can be no other argument.
I agree that on theism,
and you're still arguing that. You've lost that point. I don't think you want to move on to the next one because you think that the next one is so much weaker than your first one turned out to be. Your first one was that.
The reason I don't want to move on is because I feel like we have not yet exhausted the issue, and what we've had a lot of is
I'm feeling pretty exhausted. I don't understand how you can still be arguing for fine-tuning.
Right, okay, so let me respond to the point you raised most immediately. So your most recent point was that why is the universe so hazardous if there is
hugely wasteful.
So regarding waste,
and we're the only planet so far that we've been able to confirm that there's any life on at all, and all of it here is horrifying.
Right. Okay. So let me describe waste first. So regarding waste, I don't think that. So if there's a God, then this God has limitless resources, so it doesn't have to worry about wasting space. So there's no reason why it wouldn't.
Why do we assume assumptions? Why do we compile assumptions on top of other assumptions? If there's a God, why does it have to be unlimited?
Oh, so I think that the most so what theists normally mean by God is a being that's unlimited in its creative power.
Yeah, what theists normally mean is bigger than big and older than old and stronger than strong and all of that shit that doesn't make any sense because they're not thinking people. They're believers. So they make up a thing that makes them feel comfortable,
it's
squishy inside, and they make up that lie and they sell it. But that's not.
I don't think it's true that theists, by and large, don't think. There are lots of theistic physicists, biologists, cosmologists, people doing.
Grant, there's lots of Christian and Muslim and Hindu chemists and such, but that doesn't mean that Christianity or Islam or Hinduism are valid.
No, I wasn't saying it meant they were valid. You were saying that theists were unthinking people. And I was disagreeing.
Theism is a.
Well, you said theists.
It's not a reasoned position. It's a belief.
Well, I think there are lots of beliefs. So I believe in evolution, for example.
But that's nobody needs to believe in evolution. Stop believing in evolution. Understand it or don't. But it's not something you believe in.
Well, I think we disagree about what the word believe means.
Because you don't argue with believers. I do. I will not use the word belief to apply to anything that I understand to be real.
Okay. So, for example, suppose someone says
to be real.
So suppose someone says, "I believe."
That to be true because I can prove that it is true. That's not a belief. Believers insist what is true is only what they cannot show to be true.
Why do you think that?
Because believers argue with me every day, and they say this.
There's a difference between saying believers have this other property X and saying belief entails this other property X, right? So many believers may be dogmatic.
Understand that they're using the word to describe themselves. They're using the word believers to describe themselves. And then
But when a person says I'm a believer, they don't just mean I'm a person who has some beliefs. They mean that
they're a person who will believe regardless of the evidence.
What they mean is that they're a person with a very particular set of beliefs, namely belief largely in Christianity. Like if a person says, "I'm a believer,"
because we can go to Hinduism and it's similar. We can definitely go to the Quran, and that's way similar. Yes, they are going to proclaim things to be fact that are not fact. They're going to claim to know things they don't know, and they're going to profess knowledge out of what is baseless speculation. That's what believers mean.
Here's an analogous kind of poor inference. So imagine if someone said, atheism is the belief that evolution happened. And you're like, what? That's not the definition of atheism. And they say, well, when I talk to all these atheists, they believe in evolution. It's true that atheists, by and large, believe in evolution, but that doesn't mean that being an atheist, by definition, is belief in evolution. It just means that there's a correlation. So the fact that people who describe themselves as believers are often willing to maintain their beliefs, even if their beliefs are ultimately, not concordant with the evidence.
Even if they know that they're wrong.
Right. Then that doesn't mean that that's part of the definition of belief. That just means it's a fact about some believers. It's certainly not a fact about all believers, and I don't think it's a fact about most believers.
Two different lexicons, and I've encountered this with the creationists an awful lot. That it's not just that one belief; it's a handful of different words that they have a completely different definition for, so that we end up talking past each other. And when I give what my understanding of that is, they don't accord to that; they go to their own. Then, so a believer will say that anything that you can't prove to be a fact right now is a religion, because religion is synonymous with belief. And when
I don't think that's true.
They can't prove. They don't mean like over an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. No, they're talking about beyond unreasonable doubt. Whereas you are trying to reject the reality no matter at what cost. So
you're talking about using substandard definitions. Like
I understand that. I'm trying to illustrate something for you, but never mind. You're not interested in it, and it's not relevant anyway. So let me just read a couple of comments that we've got in here. Hannah Hodgins offers $9.99. Thank you very much for that. Why would a God create a universe where it's just so close to collapsing? Does God need his ego stoked so badly that he just needs us to see how amazing it is? What a petty God, glad he ain't real.
So my answer to that would be, so I don't know why God does many of the things he does. I happen not to have his personal telephone number. Now, it can be the case that you think
that.
No, it can be, yeah, it can be the case that you're not sure why some being would do X, and nonetheless X happening is evidence for that being involved. So, for example, Aaron, you seem like a sort of responsible and reasonable guy. I don't think that you would write like offensive poetry about George W. Bush. I would just be surprised. Okay. But if I looked in your desk drawer and I saw offensive poetry about George W. Bush, I wouldn't assume it was an ink spill. And so even if
I've already published offensive poetry about George W. Bush.
Okay, yeah, so maybe that was a bad example. But even if you think some person is unlikely to do X, you can still think that them doing X is far likelier than X just happening by chance. And so that would be my position with fine tuning, where I agree it's not guaranteed.
And then we have the issue of chance, which again, there's another one of those words that they have a different definition. Now, one way that you could say by chance means that it's not deliberate. A series of a series of circumstances inevitably led this way. That doesn't mean that it was by just rolling dice. There are processes. When you put these two chemicals together, you know what those two chemicals are going to do when they come together. It's not because of a dice roll. But believers, the people who use the argument of chance, they think everything is a dice roll. That in order for water to combine with hydrogen to make water, oxygen to combine with hydrogen to make water, that's a roll of the dice. What are the chances of that? What do you mean, what are the chances? It's a chemical reaction. Under set conditions, this will happen. No, they don't see it that way.
So when I say that it happened by chance, what I mean is the thing happening was very improbable, and it happened in a way that was not directed by an agent.
And again, probability isn't relevant if we're talking about processes. Probability only applies if things could just randomly happen by themselves without any natural processes involved. And this is
that isn't correct. So suppose suppose that I go out to the mountain. Oh wait, sorry. So suppose I go out to the mountains and I see that the stones are arranged to say, "Welcome to the mountains, Matthew Adelstein." So I assume, okay, maybe my friend set it up that way. It's perfectly reasonable to do that and to say it's unlikely that they would happen to be arranged that way by chance, even though presumably how they got there is dictated by natural laws. Even if something is dictated by natural laws, it can still be improbable that natural laws would happen to dictate it in that particular way. Or to take another example, suppose that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out made by God, right? So just when scientists discover the earliest conditions of the universe and it's spelled out made by God, it would be reasonable to say that's very unlikely to have happened by chance and look for an explanation of that in terms of design, because even though in theory it could have happened by chance, it's possible that happened by chance. It's sufficiently unlikely that such a thing would happen by chance that it's good evidence for design.
Okay, let me just kick in here a moment. When we were 40 minutes into this show, I let you know that you haven't yet given any indication that a God is possible, much less probable, much less indicated. Okay. Now we're only 4 minutes away from the end. I've got to run soon, and we still haven't got there. All you've done is, well, everything is as it is, and that means there's a God.
So one bit of evidence is fine tuning. We can talk about the other bits of evidence.
That's the evidence that a universe could exist exactly like it is. There's lots of different reasons why it could exist without a God, but the fact that it exists the way it exists means my magic imaginary friend exists. That is not a valid argument. Everybody's already told you that's not a valid argument. You won't get to a second argument because I don't think you have one. I think you have.
Well, I do, and you can read about it on my blog, right? The other arguments tend to be a bit more complicated.
I'm not going to read it on your blog because I'm here talking to you directly, and you could not, would not.
Sorry. Okay, fine. I'm happy to give another argument. So one other argument that I find rather convincing.
Would you like to try this again later? I can't do this anymore. Don't bring up fine-tuning again. If you want to do it again later, bring a different argument, hopefully one that works.
Okay, so one of the other arguments I find rather convincing is the argument from consciousness. So I think that the probability of there being consciousness is vastly, given that consciousness is very valuable, is vastly higher if there's a God than if there's not.
Again, ignoring the processes that make that necessarily emergent. And again, therefore, no God. So
I don't think it's ignoring
against God and say that they're for God.
So I don't think that
this conversation again, but we're going to have to pick it up at another time because I do have to run. I'm going to read these comments. I've got two. Satan 616 says, I have an argument against qualia. The concept of red in people's minds is not encoded in our brain as the sensation. Not entirely sure what they mean there. That Satan 616 says, and he gives 25, I think that's Romanian lay, says we encode knowledge differently in the brain than sensations. Study all you want about color. It does not translate into knowing the sensation. I think I made an argument to that effect earlier. Anyway, Matt, thank you for being on. I would be happy to do this conversation again. You're going to have to come up with a different argument than fine-tuning. You're just going to have to.
Yeah, well, we can talk about another argument some other time.
Yeah, and when you say that there's evidence, big problem I have with theists, they don't understand. Evidence is not arguments. Arguments are not evidence. Evidence is a body of facts that are positively indicative of and/or exclusively concordant with. Arguments can be used to explain evidence, but you haven't got any evidence. Try that again.
An argument will sort of bridge a pathway from certain observations about the world and will explain why those end up favoring or disfavoring a hypothesis. So the argument from fine-tuning, for instance, points to the fact about fine-tuning.
If it's not falsifiable, it doesn't even qualify as a hypothesis.
Well, I don't think that's right. So, for example, the theory
Look up what a hypothesis is. You're a philosophy student. I get that. But in science, a hypothesis is required to be falsifiable, or it's not a hypothesis.
Yeah, I guess I do think hypothesis is used in a slightly broader way in philosophy than in science, where it's just, when I was using the term hypothesis, I was just referring to it as a way that the world might be, rather than in the scientific definition of like, a sort of thing that you'll do experiments to verify in the near future.
Get back with me in email and we'll schedule a future thing. But I do have a thing I have to go to.
And All right. Thanks for having me. Have a nice rest of your day.
Yep. Thank you very much. You too.